I'm going to do something special for you guys. Startup here, startup meow. I hope you guys like cats. Anybody like cats? Everybody still, who went to the after party last night? Yeah, everybody else is still home or at their hotel. So we're going to dig in a little bit and talk a little bit about why here, why now, and how you should think of your startup in a global scale. So first of all, my background, just to give you a little context, I was born in Odessa, Ukraine, immigrated with my family at 8 years old, grew up in Silicon Valley, got started very early in startups at the age of 13 as an intern, and I grew up in Cupertino, went to the same high school as Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and really didn't know any different. I was very fortunate to grow up in that environment. Through the dot-com wave, by 18, I was already running a team, and I got to see that go up and go down. And there was, for several years, there was very little traffic on Highway 101 that goes through the middle of Silicon Valley. And now we're back. Silicon Valley is back. I've started several companies. I've run a company called Keen that has offices in San Mateo, California, in the middle of Silicon Valley, and in Kiev, Ukraine. We have an engineering team. And also, just recently, we started with CCC Startups to bridge that gap. So you already know a little bit about us, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about jumping into startups. So how many of you are already working on a startup? Raise your hands. Okay, keep them up. How many of you are thinking of jumping into startups? Right? Okay, so everybody in this room should have their hand up. Otherwise, what are you doing here? Right? So let's talk a little bit about different kinds of people, or cats, in this edition. So there are corporate cats. They're usually experts in one area, right? They spend years climbing the ladder. They have a stable lifestyle, right? Go to work at 9, come home in the evening, have dinner with your family, etc. They have real responsibilities. They have a house payment, a car, maybe some kids, a dog and a cat, etc. And they have the illusion of life balance. Right? There's some work, there's some life. Well, startups are different. People that start startups are generalists, usually. They get an early start. So I got started very early, at 13, but most startup founders get started sometime in college. Right? And these days, getting earlier and earlier. Right? But they're good at more than one thing, and you have to be, because there's nothing. You're creating it from scratch. Right? They have a cheap lifestyle because they were never spoiled with an expensive lifestyle. They started in college, they were eating ramen in college, and they stayed that way. Right? Many of you, or probably most of you, have read or heard about Mark Zuckerberg's story. Right? So they really brought college really to Silicon Valley with them. And they have nothing to lose. Right? So therefore, the only thing that matters is the startup. Think about that. So if you're already in the middle of your career, you have to think about this and know what you're getting yourself into. It is a different experience. You have to remove what's called optionality. That means you have to burn your bridges. Otherwise, you will not be committed enough to go through with it. Startups are very, very hard. So it's very important. This is an English grammar lesson. Right? It's very important to know what you're doing. So hopefully I'll give you some things to think about today that you can take with you on your journey. So what the fuck is a startup? Well, a startup is an experiment. Oh, going a little too quick there. Startup is an experiment in search of a business model. So who's read Steve Blank? Okay, you should. Speakers that came with us don't count. If you haven't heard of Steve Blank, look him up. Stanford professor, amazing genius of the startup world. Some people actually give him credit for coming up with the word startup, actually. Little known fact. So it is an experiment in search of a business model. It is not a smaller version of a large company. A new coffee shop or restaurant is not a startup. Just because it's new does not mean it's a startup, okay? That's very, very important. It is not a small version of a large company. It is an experiment. It is not really a company yet, okay? So a scalable startup, right, it's this experiment. Once you find the business model, once you find your product market fit, who you're selling the product to and how, right? You create a repeatable sales model and you start hiring managers around that sales model. You then transition to becoming a company. Until then, you're an experiment. So a lot of times startups fail when they try to do this way too early. They start hiring management not knowing what the hell they're trying to manage. That doesn't work, right? You have to conduct the experiment first. Now, when they reach break-even or become profitable, they start scaling rapidly. They start hiring senior salespeople that have worked in large companies before, and they're usually around 150 people or so. They become a company, okay? So a scalable startup is a completely different path than starting a traditional small business, even a service company, even an outsourcing company, right? There you have to make money from the start. Here the goal is to figure out who your customer is, what is their problem, and how to sell to them. So Dave McClure says, everybody's heard Dave McClure, right? Yes? Raise your hands. This is interactive. Jonathan, you've heard of Dave McClure? I'm shocked. You guys are very, very quiet. We're going to have to wake up a little bit. So a startup is a company that's confused about who its customers are, what its product is, and how to make money. That is the definition of a startup and nothing else. And I like to say that basically your default state is failure, and your job is to unfail it. If you're not going to do anything, nothing's going to happen, right? It's kind of obvious. But your default state is failure. Your job is to unfail it. It's like the old story about the two frogs trapped in boiling butter, right? You got to whip, or trapped in oil, right? And you have to whip your legs really fast to make butter and not drown, okay? So why would you want to start a company, create a startup? Why would you want to do that? It's really painful. Here's a normal career, right? It's kind of an escalator. You get good grades in school, you get into a good college, you then graduate and get into a good company, you get regular promotions, then in the US you retire, you play golf, and you die. That's a normal career, right? For the last, I don't know, 50 years, since World War II. This is where all older generation, older than Generation X, thinking, why don't you get a nice, secure job and work at a company for 10, 15, or 20 years, or your whole career? Well, if successful, your startup career is going to look a little bit different. You think it's going to look like this, right? You're going to start a company, you're going to be a success overnight. In reality, if successful, it really looks something like this, right? It is a very painful process. So you really have to be crazy to want to put yourself through this and start a startup. You really have to be crazy because it's painful and it's very difficult, right? But you have to be a little bit crazy to be able to change the world, right? You have to do something that's impossible. And the first step to doing something that's impossible is believing that you can actually do it. So why are you doing it? Have you asked yourself that? Why are you doing the startup? What's motivating you? Is it for the money? You think you're going to be rich overnight? You're going to go public? The IPO? Right? Well, let me give you a little shocking piece of news. This is tech IPO since 1999. This is the bubble. Then there was the Valley of Death and some laws in the US that makes it much more difficult to take a company public. And in 2014, there were less than 50 IPOs. Most of them in the US. I think probably 90% are US companies. How many Polish tech companies, tech startups do you know that are public? Exactly, right? So think about that. It's not going to be an IPO. So there are some statistics about funded startup success rate worldwide. Funded means raise some professional money from angel investors or VCs. So a third of them, 30%, fail outright. Return zero of the money that they've raised. A third are unprofitable, but continue for several years. Sometimes they'll get out of it, sometimes they won't. Or they'll sell for less money than they've raised. 30% are somewhat profitable. That means that they'll sell themselves for a little bit more money than they raised. And maybe 10% will return enough money to an investor for them to think that that was a success and they want to do it again. Right? That's the odds. Now, failure, right? You've all heard this thing for the last several years. Failure is good. You should fail. This is great. Well, no. If you're given a choice, if you want to fail or you want to succeed, which one are you going to choose? You're not going to choose to fail, right? So all failure is a hard lesson. And there are some things that you can only learn by doing, right? So my advice to startup founders, if you're in love with the world of startups and you really want to do that and you just got out of college, let's say, your first startup should not be your own. You should go and learn at a fast-growing startup, hopefully from people that are running it, that have failed before, learn from the previous generation. In a year at that company, you'll learn more than you will on your own in the next 10, beating your head against the wall, right? And realistically, how much time do you have? Let's say you graduate college. Let's say you give yourself 10 years to succeed, up until your early 30s. Then you want to start a family and your focus changes. How long does it take to do a startup? It takes at least 2 years to figure out if there's anything really there, right? But usually closer to 5. So maybe you have a couple, maybe 3 startups in you. You really have to make sure that you're not wasting your time. So the odds are against you, right? First-time founder, 18% chance of success. That means not losing all the money or most of the money that you raised, okay? If you failed before, right, failure is great. Well, guess what? Your chances of success as a repeat failed founder are about 2% more, second time around. Not a whole lot of difference. But if you're a repeat successful founder, your chances almost double, right? So you learn a lot more from success than from failure. So again, try to go and work with a fast-growing, successful startup. You will learn a lot from them. If you're lucky and you're good, you will get acquired. That is a realistic goal, especially in Europe right now. Going public is very much a stretch goal. It's very, very difficult. You really have to structure everything for an exit by acquisition. Now, maybe you're doing it for freedom. You want to be free. You don't want to have a boss. Well, in a normal job, you have one boss, right? In a startup, every single user or customer is your boss. Right? If you've ever started a service company, it's kind of similar, right? If you have a family, they will suffer. You will spend less time with your family. You'll be stressed out. It will all reflect on your family, right? So Ben Horowitz from Andreessen Horowitz, great quote. As a startup CEO, I slept like a baby. I woke up every 2 hours and cried. This is reality, right? So most of our speakers have started companies or funded companies, and they can tell you from personal experience, this is what it's like. So have I talked you out of doing startups yet? Are you going to quit, just leave, and go get a job at a bank and forget about all this stuff? Yes? Who's going to quit? Raise your hand. Jonathan's going to quit. Most active participant. So it's very important that you think about your morale and your team's morale, right? It's very easy to have a bad day or a series of bad days, right? And you're going to say to yourself, man, today sucked, this week sucked, this month sucked. But what you have to really look at is the big picture. The big picture is, are we doing better than we were doing 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago? Are we making progress? And keep yourself motivated by thinking about that, okay? So good news is that you can improve your chances. This is a Uber meme right here. It's a mashup. First of all, it's the problem that you're solving, right? Part of what will keep you really motivated is if you're solving a problem that you're passionate about. It's a problem that you can't live without solving. It's keeping you up at night. When you have an idea and you're thinking about it for 6 months, and 6 months later you still think it's a good idea, you actually think it's a better idea than it was when you originally thought of it, that's maybe something to invest your time in and build a startup around, okay? Now, a very important thing for a lot of engineer founders is don't build a technology that's looking for a problem to solve. Find a painful problem with a specific customer and then build technology to solve that. If you build a toy for yourself, you know, it's very likely that you build something for a market of 1 for yourself. It's very likely that you will not be able to turn that into a product that somebody wants to buy or use. So what is all this lean bullshit? Everybody's heard this lean startup thing, right? It's very easy. Lean means quick iterations, right? Because quick iterations give you multiple chances to solve the problem. Remember, your startup is an experiment. You need a few different attempts at the experiment to be able to solve it. Chances are you will not solve it right away with the first attempt, right? It's more chances to unfail, right? So what's a good startup? Let's think about that for a second. When you're analyzing your idea and you're thinking, should I really do this? So the most important thing and everything you should focus on at the beginning is not sitting there writing code and polishing this thing, but getting somebody to use it. Getting somebody to use it at an increasing rate. If you can get somebody to pay for using it, that's even better, right? But if they're not using it for free, they probably won't pay you for it either, right? Very simple, but not quite obvious when you look at a few companies. It solves a painful problem for a specific customer. You have to think about, when you pitch even, right, you're pitching the problem. When somebody comes to us and pitches their startup and they start talking about, we developed this thing on Java with such and such database, this and that, we don't care what the technology is. We care about who's the customer, what's the problem, some context, and to understand whether your solution, your approach is the right way. Well, how can you be sure you're solving a problem, right, versus something that you just think is a problem? How is it currently being solved? If it's a problem, people are trying to solve it somehow, some way right now. It might be by email, by phone call, using mobile technology, but you're doing something else, right? There's always an opportunity for you to innovate. With different technology paradigms, you have a new way, new opportunity to solve the same old problems in a more convenient, better, cheaper, faster way, right? If you come out on stage and you say, hey, we have no competition, this is the worst rookie mistake for a startup. Because what that means is that you have no problem and you probably have no market. So never come on stage and say, we have no competition. Because then nobody cares about what you're doing. So what you really have to do, and you have to force yourself, especially if you're the engineer, the coder that likes computers more than people, is you have to stop coding, you have to get out of the building, right? Get out of your house, get out of your office, go talk to your customers. If you can talk to them in person, it's even better. Body language is an important thing, right? Face your fears. Most people are afraid to talk to customers. They're afraid that somebody's going to call their little software baby ugly, right? But you have to get that feedback. And you have to validate your assumptions. Don't think you're right. Most times you're going to be wrong. You have to go to your customers. They are the ones that have to tell you this is good, this is bad. Don't try to sell that to them. Don't try to convince them of anything. Get that feedback and see where you can improve. And you have to do it really fast, right? Is the current state of affairs in your industry hard, expensive, painful? How are you different and better? You can't just be different for the sake of being different. You have to be different and fundamentally better, right? Obvious to anybody outside the industry, right? If you come to me and say, talk chemistry or physics or something else that I'm not an expert in, it still has to be obvious to me why your approach is better, right? And it has to be a big market. Why is it a big market? Why is a big market important? Big and growing market? Because a rising tide lifts all boats. If your market is growing 20% a year, you have to be just average to grow 20% a year. If you're going into a market and you're just fighting big companies and you're trying to do business their way, you will never catch up to them, right? If anybody knows military strategy, it's called flanking. You have to figure out a different way to attack and disrupt big businesses, right? And big industries that are growing fast. And you have to understand your business model. Maybe you're not going to monetize, which is kind of a made-up Silicon Valley word, but maybe you're not going to charge for your product right away. You want to build it up first. But you have to know and plan for what you're going to do eventually, right? There are two types of business models generally. There are these symmetric business models, which are very simple. You solve somebody's problem, they pay you for the solution. This is the subscription, this is the one-time purchase app, etc. This is very popular in Europe, right? You build a SaaS business, you start generating revenue very fast this way. And then there are asymmetric business models. Asymmetric business models means that somebody else pays for the customer experience, right? Facebook is the classic asymmetric business model. It's advertising supported. It's great if you can get there, but the problem is that you need a very large audience for that money to start to flow. Right? 10 million is the new 1 million users. You need 10 million users to make any kind of substantial asymmetric business model type of product. And you're going to hear this word a lot, scale. What does scale mean? Right? Everybody throws the word around, but they don't really kind of dig in and try to understand the definition in this context. Well, scale really means revenue per employee at full speed. Can I build this thing once and then sell it over and over and over again? Right? Is it a product or is it really a service? So if we look at a few companies that I'm sure you know, so Craigslist does $3.6 million per employee. But, there's a big but, they have 23 employees. Craigslist has 23 employees. McDonald's, on the other hand, does $64,000 per employee. But they have 1.7 million employees worldwide. Now, if you were to go to VCs today and say, hey, I want to fund McDonald's and here's my business model, it's going to require 1.7 million employees, well, that's a little risky. It sounds a little expensive. You're probably not going to get that funded. Now, if you look at Apple to Amazon, and these numbers are about a year old, so Apple's doing even better now, but you're really shooting for about $1 million per employee per year. Now, when you're doing your financial projections, this is a great goal to shoot for in year 4 or 5. Now, if you can get to $1 million per employee in 5 years, you have a fantastic business. If you can prove it, any venture capitalist with any kind of brain will write you a check. But if you go into a presentation, you're showing projections, and you're showing your hockey stick slide, and all of a sudden you're making $100 million per employee in year 2, and you're the fastest growing startup in the history of startups, well, any investor is going to look at that and laugh you out of the room. So it's a little bit of a test. Are you crazy or are you not? Right? Now, when you're building one of these startup businesses, don't forget that you're trying to build a repeatable business model. So what that means is you need to measure everything. How much money are you spending on advertising? How many people are coming to the site? How are they converting? How long are they staying? Are they bringing a friend who's also spending money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? You have to measure every single point, and this is how you dial in your business. You're going to be you're going to be looking at graphs and charts much more than Photoshop and pixels. And when you're first starting out, the main ingredient is your team. There's really nothing else. It's an idea and a team. And you go to an investor and say, well, we have this idea. There's this big market. Okay, that's great. Now, why should I invest in you? Why not invest in somebody else? Right? Hiring is very hard. So this is somewhere you're going to get stuck, especially in Europe. There's just not enough certain type of talent. What you don't have is much money, or any money to begin with. You don't have stability. You can't promise that to somebody, right? So somebody with certain lifestyle, family, kids, etc., that needs to make a certain amount of money and know they're not going to lose their job in a month, it's going to be very difficult to attract them, right? You have no support infrastructure. You don't have a retirement fund. You might not have, well, in Europe you have social health benefits. In the US, that's a big question, but we won't get into that today. And you have no long-term plan, not something believable, right? So if you can convince somebody of your vision, it's a vision, but if you can't, it's a hallucination, right? So you have to promise them something. What do you have? You have stock. So if you've convinced somebody and they're as passionate about your idea as you are, they will want to own a piece of it. This is when you give stock. You get to, they're as crazy as you. They think that it's going to succeed, and they want a piece of that dream, that one day they're going to become a billionaire because they have a piece of this company. Now, you can also offer flexibility. You can work, you can work any time of the day you want. You can work any 14 hours of the day that you want, right? It doesn't have to be 9 to 5. It could be, 10 to midnight, etc. And the most important thing is that the person or your initial team at least, has to be very passionate about the problem. They want to make a difference. They want to change the lives of your customers or users just as much as you do, sometimes more, right? That passion has to be there. Otherwise, you're going to lose motivation. Okay? And you have to have a balanced startup team, right? What does that mean? You have to know the business you're getting into. Why are you going to solve this problem, not somebody that just graduated out of Stanford or Harvard or somewhere else? Why are you smarter than the average bear? Do you have 10 years of deep experience in this industry? You better, right? If you come in as a stranger into this industry, it's going to take you a couple of years to learn how it works and build up the contacts. So that will probably, not be something that investors want to pay for. They don't want to pay for your education. They want to pay you because you already know the problem from the inside. You have to be able to build a product, right? If you're in a software business, you cannot outsource your core competency, which is to build software, right? So it can't be a couple of business school graduates saying, oh, you know what? We're going to start a startup. It'll be great. We'll have some other company build a product for us. Okay, well, maybe even if you do an equity deal with them for that first iteration, and you give them 5% of the company, let's just do simple arithmetic. You're going to have to change that product 20 times. But at the end of that process, they're going to own your product. They're going to own your company. You have to be able to build software. I can't impress on this anymore. And you have to be able to design. Design is the minimum entry into products now. Even B2B products, business software, or before people didn't really care much about the user experience and design. Now there's what's called the consumerization of B2B. Means that people in their daily life are so used to using software and applications that are a pleasure to use that they expect that at work now. So you're going to see a whole wave of B2B applications shift into and focus on good design. And you can see more and more companies win just because they have a more pleasant product to work with, to use. And you have to have an unfair advantage. What is your unfair advantage? When you're pitching somebody, you have to say, well, we're going to win because, right? And that because has to be strong and obvious. Not because we're here in front of you and somebody else isn't, right? You have to talk about your accomplishments. Have you raised money? Who did you raise money from? That's a very important signal. If you raise money from your rich uncle, that's not going to help you with professional investors. But if you raised money from a venture fund that somebody knows, it's much more likely that another venture fund will be wanting to invest in your company. This social proof is a very important factor. If you have partnerships, there's a good and a bad thing about partnerships with large companies. What you think you're going to get out of those partnerships is that big company selling the product for you. That will never happen. Forget about it. What it does help you with is shows that a large company invests their time and resources into you. That's validation. That's all it really is, right? If you come with a pitch deck and say, our marketing strategy is we're going to find partners that are going to sell us in the US. How many of you guys have that slide in your pitch deck? We're going to find partners in the US, and they're going to do everything for us. Growth. The most important thing is growth. So if you have traction, you always lead with traction, because that solves all problems. If your business is growing, that means you have a relative handle on everything else. That everything else is at least okay, if not very good, right? We'll quickly go through slides here. Let's see. So in Silicon Valley, here's how funding works, right? You usually start the product, the startup with bootstrapping, friends and family, and fools. People that know you, people that will invest in you personally. They believe in you, or they want to see you succeed. These are not going to be professional investors. This is usually the idea stage. The next step is accelerators, usually. And you're going to hear from some great accelerator heads that we brought with us today from Europe and from the US, more about that. Next, you usually have angels and seed VCs. This is when there's already a product, there's already some kind of initial traction showing that somebody needs this thing. Then you're going to grow very quickly if you are, right? So the funnel narrows very, very quickly, and it's hard to survive to the next step. But if you do, then you're going to be talking to bigger funds that will write multi-million-dollar checks. Growth equity, these are the really big unicorn type of rounds that you've been hearing about. And then you'll get sold at some point, maybe somewhere along this track, or you go public, right? That's kind of the ladder that you'll climb. That's a normal expectation. Europe looks a little bit different. So bootstrapping, friends, family, and fools, there's a lot less disposable money to be able to do that these days. There are over 200 accelerators. There are over 200 accelerators in Europe, right? So there's plenty of that. There's only a few, though, that are worth doing. Right? There's an article that came out in Forbes just last week that did the numbers, and most accelerators provide zero value. They do not help the average startup. There are maybe 10, 20 accelerators worldwide that have the right type of mentors, the right type of structure, and the experience to actually help startups. Everybody else is wasting their time. There's very little in the middle. The angels and seed VCs, that is the problem area in Europe right now. This is an area that we're focused on as CCC as well. And this is something that needs work. There are some larger funds, but again, if you can't get this capital in the middle here, you're never going to survive to that level, right? There's plenty of growth equity in big banks, and then, of course, the sales and IPOs usually leave to the US, which is a problem for European economies because they don't get to capture that value. All of that leaves to the US, right? All that hard work. So in 2001, something happened, right? All the US VC funds ran away from Europe because there were enough problems at home, and only a handful survived in Europe, the actual European VCs. Mostly UK, some in Germany. Now that's changing a bit, and it's really much easier now to start a startup anywhere than it was in 1999 in the middle of Silicon Valley. The reason for that is that we have a whole new set of tools, especially around mobile, right? So this is, many of you have seen this picture. This is Vatican 2005. This is Vatican 2013, right? With the welcoming of the new Pope. The world has gone through a major change. And you have new tools of the trade that you never had before. So you have no excuse. You can start a startup anywhere. You can sign up for Amazon Web Services and be online in 30 seconds. Before, it took a couple of $1 million and a couple of months to buy hardware, put it in a co-location facility, right? So those of you that went through the first .com wave, remember that. Those that didn't don't even know that that existed, right? You have PayPal to take payments. You have AdWords, Facebook, and Twitter to advertise. You have the app stores as distribution channels that get your product instantly to your customers' hands. You did not have that in 1999. You didn't have most of that up until about 10 years ago, right? I have no comment for this slide. I just thought you'd enjoy it. So venture capital is changing, right? And if you look at the exits, you get to read about these giant exits and these giant funding rounds. The reality is majority of the exits are between $10 and $80 million, okay? Everybody's heard of Y Combinator, right? Yes, I hope so. So Y Combinator, by far the most successful accelerator in the world, their median exit is only $20 million. They funded almost, well, actually about 800 companies or more at this point, over 10 years. So even Y Combinator, they have some outliers. They have a handful of companies that are worth billions, but majority of the ones that survive to exit are only about $20 million exits, right? You can do that in Europe. It's realistic. That's a realistic goal. So why here and why now? Europe produces higher venture exit multiples than US because it's cheaper to create startups in Europe. This competition for talent, first and foremost, is not as insane. Your one-bedroom apartment is not going to cost you $5,000 like it does in San Francisco, right? Now, European exits are about 25% smaller, but the entry valuations are 3 to 4 times cheaper for investors. So you're going to be seeing a lot more investors. And Europe produces about half as many exits as the US, about a third of the home run 100 million plus exits, but only 1/5 of the money. That's how much more efficient it is. Europe has a huge advantage over the US. You just have to be more confident, right? So if you look at exits in the US versus Europe, For investors, it's almost twice as, no, 1.5 times good, right? Their money will actually generate much more exits. And for the entire venture class, without diving into what venture capital is and how it works, for it to make sense, it has to be a 6x exit. So most of US venture capital actually underperforms what it promises its investors. And as we already mentioned before, is that European venture capital investments are growing very quickly, very rapidly. So brace yourselves, investors are coming, if you haven't already seen it. And Poland actually has a lot of seed investments because the Polish government put a lot of money into this investment class and is trying to create innovation, right? Next step is a little bit more experienced type of investors that can provide more help than just money, but that's coming as well, right? So looking forward, I'll leave you with 3 things. First of all, win your home market first. Prove to yourself that you can succeed here, you can compete here. You don't necessarily need to build a billion-dollar company locally, but if you're not going to be able to win against local companies on home turf, you definitely will not be able to do that in the US. It's going to be a lot harder. Silicon Valley is the Olympic Games of startups. Now, as soon as you are able to gain a little bit of experience, a little bit of success, you should mentor and help your community of startups. You should give back. That's a big part of what happens in Silicon Valley. That's a big part of the success. Startup Weekend has come up with a great formula, and they've done great research, and I'll post these slides so you can go to the link. But this is what it takes to build an ecosystem. It takes talent, and there's certainly plenty of technical and some growing sales and marketing talent in Europe. It takes density, right? It needs big enough market, populations that are interesting, and Poland with 38 million population is a pretty great place to start. There should be a culture of entrepreneurialism. That means it's okay to fail, because if it's not okay to fail, like in Japan or Korea, for example, then people will not take risks. That's a big problem. It should be okay. There should be no stigma with somebody failing, right? That comes also with some regulations that will not put you into debtor's prison if your company goes out of business and owes some money. You should not take that with you personally for the rest of your life, right? Too big of a risk. And of course, there needs to be capital, right? And there's already plenty of seed capital in Poland, and there's more and more in Europe overall, but it's growing. So with that, I'll close. If you'd like the slides, follow me on Twitter, and I'll give you also another little present. I have a book coming later this year. You can download the first chapter, and it's about self-accelerating your startup. So with that, thank you very much, and I will hand it off to Mike.